It was 2 a.m. when Percy decided he was ready to head home. After a night out of drinks and socializing, his patience and energy was starting to wear thin. If he wasn't careful, his pleasant night out would teeter into disaster. Downing the last of his beer, he waved goodbye to his friends, shaking off their advances to stay for just one more round. He left the warm embrace of the bar, stepping outside onto the streets, not ready for the cool fall air greeting him. It was only a short walk home from the bar, but it had never seemed so far away. Rubbing the sides of his arms, he tried to warm himself, or at least briefly distract him from the cold. His attempt succeeded, but only in distracting himself, leading him to miss his turn off the main road towards his house. Starting to shiver from the cold again, he now found himself at the edge of Iakoy Park, letting him know he'd gone too far. Shit, he muttered to himself, looking up at the large metal archway above the entrance. Turning around to go, he heard a faint crying drift in from the woods. Glancing over his shoulder, he ignored the sound carrying on his way. He only made it to steps before his conscience got the better of him, urging him to go check it out. With a heavy sigh full of self-loathing, he stepped into the park. Walking along the dirt trail, he followed the muffled crying. "Hello, are you okay?" He called out into the night, but no one answered back. The fall leaves rustled in the trees and crunched under his boots, breaking up the muffled whimper. Continuing along the path going deeper into the park, the crying began to get louder. Soon it was the sobbing that drowned out all the other ambient noise of the leaves. He was right on top of the sound, but there was no one in sight. "Hello," Percy shouted again, even louder. For a moment the crying stopped, long enough for Percy to hear the trickle of nearby water. He hadn't realized he had come right up along the river cutting through the park. An instant later the crying turned into a wail, howling out in agony. This time there was no doubt where the sound was coming from. Pulling back the bushes bordering the path, he peered through, catching a glance at the source of the noise. Standing out in the middle of the stream was a woman cradling a swaddled baby. She looked soaked to the bone, with her long black hair draped over her face. On the verge of shivering himself, Percy thought the woman must be frozen to her core. Lost in his thought, Percy idly shifted his weight, crunching the leaves beneath him, trying to figure out what to do. Hearing the noise, the woman's head snapped, turning towards Percy. Startled, Percy let go of the bushes, letting them snap back into place. But for a brief moment their eyes met. Something at his core felt unsettled by the look in her bright green eyes. Part of him wanted to walk away, but he knew he couldn't leave the woman and her child to freeze to death. "Hello, do you need help?" he asked, stepping out from around the bushes. The woman mumbled something through light sobbing that Percy couldn't quite make out. Stepping closer, he tried to reassure her. "It's okay, I'm going to help get you out of there, and we'll get you warmed up." Though he had just promised to get her out, standing on the bank of the water, he had no idea what to do. "I can't move," the woman cried out helplessly. "Please, take my child. I can't let her get wet. Promise me you'll save my baby." The woman jutted the child out towards him with outstretched arms. It was bundled so tightly in the blanket he couldn't even see the baby's face, but he could hear its soft cries. "Sure, I promise I'll get your baby out of here." Cautiously approaching, Percy stepped onto the bank of the river, sinking into the mud. Worried about sinking in himself, he stood in place, reaching his arms out to take the child. As he took the child, cradling it close to his chest, he caught a glimpse of the mother's eyes. A violent shiver shot up his spine, making him almost drop the child. Seeing the eyes up close, something looked off. Her eyes looked predatory, almost reptilian. Pushing the thought out of his mind, he focused on getting the child to safety. "Let me set your child down somewhere safe, and I'll come back for you," Percy said, trying to sound confident and comforting but failing in both. Fighting his way out of the mud, Percy rushed back to the path to set the child down. After a few steps, his head had cleared enough to wonder how the woman got stuck in the river to begin with. Turning back around to ask the woman, Percy saw her head slide into the water, the shadow of her body fading down, disappearing into the river. Holding the child, he called out to her, shouting, "Hey, hey." Bubbles rose up from the calm water where the woman had been. Looking around in a panic, Percy hoped someone else would appear to help. The eerie silence of being alone worried him more than the wailing. Standing indecisively with the child, he watched as the air bubbles puttered out. He told himself this can't be happening, but the child in his arms wouldn't let him debate otherwise. In his indecision, the mother had disappeared beneath the water, leaving Percy with her child. He could feel a weight tugging at his heart, even though he had just met the woman. For a split second he almost jumped in after her, but wondered what would happen to the child if he froze out in the cold. Percy felt the weight of his promise and knew he needed to find help for the child. Heading back down the path he had come in, he moved in a light jog, trying his best not to disturb the child. Fueled by adrenaline, 3 minutes passed in the blink of an eye as the leaves crunched under his feet. Skidding to a stop in the leaves, he looked around in confusion. Did I take a wrong turn? I should have been out of the park by now. Even though there was only a single path winding through the park, it seemed to have led him deeper in instead of out. Picking up the pace, his run turned into a jog. jostling the baby up and down. Despite the rough bouncing, the baby stayed quiet through the trip. Percy hoped that wasn't a bad sign. The temperature began to plunge, and fog drifted in through the trees. Percy held the baby close in an attempt to keep it warm. He was trying to remain calm, but the fact that he should have made it out of the park twice by now began to make his mind spiral. Continuing down the path, he looked out for any other option, but there was only the single path straight through. Increasingly thick fog blurred the path ahead. He didn't see the spider web stretching across the path. Walking face first through the web, Percy recoiled back in disgust, brushing the web off his face. Dozens of spider webs spanned across the trees bordering the path that stretched out in front of him. Picking up a nearby stick, Percy waved it out in front of him, knocking away the webs. A bundle of tenacious spider webs rapidly built up on the end of the stick. The deeper he pushed forward, the denser the spider webs became. Normally he would have been panicking from the spiders, but instead took solace in the fact that he strangely hadn't seen any actual spiders. Maybe even they had the good sense to hunker down out of this cold. Swinging through web after web, the stick soon became coated in the thick white fibers, now more web than stick. Knocking away the webs had become a rhythmic swinging, letting Percy focus on his worries. That is, until the stick soundly collided with the web, trapping in place instead of tearing through. The web that lay before him was much thicker than the previous layers that he had easily knocked his way through. Unable to pry the stick back, he was hesitant to try to break through the tenacious web with anything else. In his mind, this was surely the last obstacle between him and his freedom from the park. If he could just break through, he would be able to find help for the baby. Going against his better judgment, he reared his leg back, ready to kick at the web. Before he could go through with the kick, a loud snort from behind startled him. Clutching the baby tightly, he turned, looking around for the source of the sound. One long pointed gray rod crept in through the fog, reaching out toward Percy. It wasn't until 5 other identical shapes danced in through the fog that Percy realized what it was. The long legs of a massive gray spider, even larger than himself, had descended down on the path behind him. Surrounded by trees and spider webs, he found himself cornered by the creature. Taking its time, the spider gracefully lowered itself down through the fog, settling down on path. As it set itself down on the path, Percy came face to face with a bull's head jutting out from the spider's abdomen. Letting out another loud snort into Percy's face, the creature began swaying its head back and forth. Percy almost dropped the baby nestled in his arms from the sheer shock of the creature. Clutching the baby tighter in his arms, Percy made a desperate attempt to escape, darting between the narrow space between the creature and the spider webs clinging to the trees. While the creature was large, it most certainly wasn't slow. The moment Percy lunged forward, the creature slung its head out to the side. The creature's wide horns clipped into Percy's arm, taking out a chunk of flesh. Unable to hold the baby through the pain, the small, tightly wrapped bundle tumbled down on the path with a thud. Reeling from the creature's strike, Percy found himself tangled in the spider webs bordering the path. Percy reached out, trying to grab the child, but couldn't disentangle himself from the web. The baby stayed unsettlingly quiet, lying on the ground in a motionless pile. Setting its sights on Percy, the creature walked past the baby, showing it no concern at all. In the creature's disregard for the child, one of its long, spindly legs brushed the bundled child, lightly rolling it across the ground. The cloth unfurled, rolling across the path, revealing the bundle within. Percy mentally prepared for the worst, worried the child hadn't even cried from hitting the ground. As the bundle of cloth came unfurled, it was confusion that washed over Percy. Instead of a baby in the cloth, there was a tightly bound pile of leaves. No longer bound in the cloth, they scatter in the wind. Rapidly replaying the events from earlier through the night, Percy tried desperately to piece together what had happened. Nothing seemed to make any sense after stepping foot into the park at all. If he just had more time, maybe he could put together what had happened, but time wasn't on his side. The creature's legs picked up speed, barreling towards Percy, bound by the spider's web. Able to dodge, the creature scooped Percy up with its horns, tossing him up into the air, then slamming him back into the ground. Through the jarring impact, Percy could feel a crack in his chest, followed by throbbing pain. Barely able to breathe, all he could do was watch on helplessly. Ramming the tip of its pointed horn into Percy's chest, the creature jerked his head, tearing away a chunk of Percy's flesh. All Percy could manage in return was a strained scream for help. Percy tried to steady his breathing, fighting to stay conscious, but his breathing became shallow gasps. In his narrowing vision, he could see the mother's silhouette approaching from behind the creature. Her walk was unusual, swaying heavily from side to side. "Have you seen my baby?" she asked, getting closer. As she closed the distance, he realized that she wasn't walking at all. She was slithering her way down the path. The woman's bedraggled black hair now hung down over the body of a snake instead of a woman. Percy wanted to scream out one more time, but could only manage a faint gasp before the creature's bullhead slammed down on him once more. What did you think of today's story? Let us know below.